They say you must kill your ego to find peace, but that's a lie. Killing the ego doesn't make you enlightened. It makes you empty. The ego isn't your enemy, it's your anchor to reality. Without it, you don't become free, you disappear. For years, people have been told that the ego must die if they want to find peace or enlightenment. It's repeated like a holy mantra in spiritual circles, meditation retreats, and self-help books. The ego is painted as the villain, the source of pain, pride, and separation. Kill the ego, they say, and you'll finally be free. But the truth is far more complicated. The death of the ego isn't enlightenment. It's psychological suicide. Carl Jung warned about this kind of thinking long before modern spirituality made it fashionable. He saw the ego not as an enemy to destroy, but as a vital part of the human psyche, the bridge between the inner world and the outer one. Without it, we lose our sense of identity, our ability to make meaning, our very place in reality. The ego is not the problem. The problem is believing it's all we are. When someone tries to kill their ego, what they often end up doing is splitting their mind in half. They start to disown parts of themselves that feel unspiritual: anger, ambition, desire, even individuality. They call it detachment, but it's really denial. They think they're transcending the self, but they're just amputating pieces of their humanity. Jung would call this falling into the shadow. And once the shadow takes over, enlightenment turns into madness. The ego, in Jung's model, is the conscious center of the personality, the I that faces the world. It gives us structure, memory, and continuity. It's what lets us say, "I am me," from one day to the next. When people speak about ego death, they often imagine something liberating, a kind of oceanic oneness, a merging with everything. But if that state becomes permanent, it's not transcendence, it's psychosis. The person dissolves into the collective unconscious, losing the very thing that anchors them to reality. This is why many mystical experiences feel both divine and terrifying. A glimpse beyond the ego can expand awareness, but living there is unbearable. You can visit the infinite, but you can't stay there and remain human. Jung knew this through his own near-psychotic visions, what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. He didn't destroy his ego, he rebuilt it stronger, wider, more aware. He called that process individuation, not ego death, but ego integration. The irony is that the ego death movement often comes from the same ego it claims to transcend. The desire to be pure consciousness, to be superior to ordinary people, to achieve enlightenment faster. That's ego talking. It hides behind spiritual language, but it's still the same need to be special. In trying to escape the ego, people create a new one, the enlightened self. This is where modern spirituality loses touch with psychology. Many teachers mistake dissociation for awakening. They tell followers to detach from the self, erase identity, or become nothing. That sounds peaceful in theory, but in practice it breeds confusion, passivity, and mental collapse. A person who cannot say "I," cannot love, create, or even take responsibility, they become a hollow shell, mistaking emptiness for peace. Real awakening doesn't destroy the ego. It transforms it. It turns the ego from a tyrant into a servant, a clear channel through which consciousness can act. Jung's idea of the self, with a capital S, isn't an erasure of the small self, but its expansion. It's the point where the conscious and unconscious unite, where a person becomes whole, not void. Enlightenment, if it means anything at all, is not about losing yourself, but finding yourself completely. The parts you hide, the parts you deny, the parts you fear, it's the opposite of ego death. It's ego rebirth. The people who chase ego death often confuse numbness with peace. They believe detachment means freedom from pain, But detachment taken too far leads to apathy. You stop caring, not because you're enlightened, but because you're empty. It's a quiet form of suicide, celebrated as awakening. You don't transcend the world, you fade out of it. Jung warned that when people try to erase their individuality in the name of spirituality, they fall prey to the collective psyche. They lose their center and become absorbed by archetypes, ideologies, or movements that promise higher consciousness. But behind every utopian ideal, there's a shadow. Every claim of purity hides a hunger for control. When you abandon your ego, something else takes its place, and it's rarely divine. To be truly awake means to stand between two worlds, the finite and the infinite, without losing your balance, to hold the light and the dark at once, without collapsing into either. That's what Jung meant by individuation, becoming who you are, not escaping who you are. If the first mistake of modern spirituality is believing the ego must die, the second is pretending that the death of identity is freedom. It's not. It's the collapse of structure, and when structure collapses, chaos fills the space. You can see this all over today's spiritual landscape. People chase, go death, through psychedelics, intense meditation, or self-denial, believing that dissolving into nothingness will make them whole. But they don't realize what they're playing with. The ego isn't a spiritual parasite, it's a fragile bridge. Break it completely, and you fall into the unconscious. You stop being a person who has experiences and become a creature consumed by them. That's not transcendence. That's fragmentation. Many people who report go-death experiences describe a terrifying emptiness afterward. They lose motivation, purpose, even personality. They drift through life, unable to reconnect with ordinary reality. Some call it spiritual depression. Jung would have called it a crisis of individuation, a failed attempt to unite with the self without first grounding the ego. This is why his approach to psychology was so radical. Jung didn't tell people to kill their egos. He told them to meet them, to understand them, to face their shadow, to see how their wounds and defenses protect something sacred inside. Enlightenment, in his sense, wasn't a moment of escape, but a long process of becoming fully conscious. That's what most people don't want to hear. True awakening isn't blissful, it's brutal. You don't rise above your humanity, you walk straight into it. You learn how to carry your darkness without being destroyed by it. When the ego dies prematurely, through trauma, unintegrated mystical experiences, or spiritual manipulation, the mind becomes unanchored. It can no longer distinguish between inner symbols and outer reality. That's when people start to believe they're divine prophets, reincarnated masters, or the center of some cosmic plan. The personality inflates instead of dissolving. Jung called this ego-inflation, and it's one of the most dangerous traps on the path to self-realization. Ironically, the people shouting the loudest about ego death often have the biggest egos. They've built an identity around having no identity. They wear spiritual humility like a crown, but behind that mask is a desperate need to be seen as enlightened. It's a subtle power game. I am nothing, therefore I am greater than you. This is how the ego survives every attempt to kill it by disguising itself as holiness. Jung believed that real transformation requires dialogue between the conscious and the unconscious, not domination of one over the other. When you kill the ego, you silence that dialogue. When you integrate it, you allow the deeper self to speak through it. The goal is not to dissolve the why, but to align it with something larger, something that gives it depth, meaning, and direction. In practice, this means learning to live with contradiction. The enlightened person is not pure light. They are someone who has walked through their inner darkness and learned how to hold it without judgment. They don't pretend to be beyond human emotions. They just don't let those emotions run the show anymore. But our culture, obsessed with shortcuts, prefers the fantasy of sudden awakening. We want enlightenment in 30 days. We want the ego gone by morning. The internet makes it worse. Spirituality has become a marketplace of identities. Everyone's selling wisdom, but few have actually lived it. You can post about letting go of the self, while still checking every like and comment to see how loved you are. That's not ego death. That's ego addiction in disguise. This is why the phrase psychological suicide fits so well. When people reject their individuality, they erase the very foundation of sanity. The ego is not your enemy, it's your instrument. It can serve the divine, but it cannot be replaced by it. There's an old Zen story about a monk who asked his master, "What happens after enlightenment?" The master replied, "You carry water and chop wood." That line is usually taken to mean simplicity, that enlightenment makes the ordinary sacred, but it also means grounding. After you touch the infinite, you return to the finite. You still have a body, a mind, an ego. You still live, love, struggle, and work. The difference is you do it consciously. The true master isn't the one who kills his ego, but the one who makes peace with it. He no longer identifies only with the ego, but he doesn't destroy it either. He sees it as a tool, necessary, but not ultimate. He can laugh at his own thoughts, desires, and fears without rejecting them. That's what Jung meant by wholeness. Not perfection, not purity, wholeness. The self contains both heaven and hell, light and shadow, God and the animal. To become whole is to accept that truth, not to erase one side of it. Ego death, as it's often promoted, is an escape from that tension. It's a refusal to grow up spiritually. It's easier to dissolve into oneness than to stand in the fire of self-awareness. True awakening demands courage, the courage to face yourself as you are, to integrate what you discover, and to live it out in the world. So no, the death of the ego is not enlightenment. It's the destruction of the very bridge that leads to it. The path is not self-erasure but self-integration. To awaken doesn't mean to disappear. It means to become fully alive, to let the ego serve the soul, instead of pretending you can live without one. You don't transcend the self by killing it. You transcend it by understanding it so completely that it no longer controls you. That is the difference between psychological suicide and true enlightenment. One empties you out. The other makes you whole.